So a little bit about me. My name is Dan Milnor, and I am the creative evangelist for Blurb Books. I have been lurking around Blurb since 2007. I started on their advisory board, and then I went part-time in 2010, and then I went full-time almost immediately thereafter, and I've been there ever since. They can't get rid of me. I'm like a bad book virus in a way. So Blurb has been a really instrumental part of my career. I spent basically the entire bulk of my adult life working as a photographer. So I started as a journalist, moved into magazine work, did fashion, did portraiture, did advertising, did little commercials. So I've sort of bounced around and done a lot of things. And now I work pretty much full-time in the book world, helping other people like you do your own books. So the next thing I need to do here before we really get into the presentation is I got to make a few comments about Reedsy. And I'm going to read what Reedsy had supplied me, but I also just want to boil that down into layman's terms about how I feel about Reedsy, because they're a bunch of really cool people. But if you want to learn more about writing, publishing, and marketing better books, Reedsy Learning now offers dozens of free online courses for authors. Each course lasts 10 days, with lessons delivered straight to your inbox every morning. Each lesson takes less than 5 minutes of your time, which is super strategic. So it's perfect for reading over a cup of coffee or the train to work. I prefer the coffee. I mean, who doesn't love coffee? And Reedsy and coffee go really well. One of the latest is How to Self-Publish a Photography Book, which I recently wrote for Reedsy Live. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today, I actually did a 10-part course for them as well, which you can also find. It covers a lot of the same stuff we're going to talk about today. And you can go to reedsy.com/learning to enroll for free. So I expect all of you to race after this is over to Reedsy Learning and sign up. So are you guys ready for the presentation? I'm pretty ready for the presentation. It's right here. So in a nutshell, why are you here and what are you going to learn from this and what might you be making? So think about things like portfolio, children's book, business books, magazines, digital books. All of these are totally valid reasons to be here and to be listening to this program. I'm going to break this into 5 sections. Making great work, editing and sequencing, choosing software, making the right book or books, and making test books. And now each one of those sections will have 3 or 4 smaller points inside. And at the end of each one of those sections, I'm going to stop and I'm going to take questions. So if you have any questions, save them, write them in, and they will curate them for me and I will read them off and we will go from there. So the first section that I need to talk about is about making great work. So I'm guessing that a lot of you out there are photographers, and I want to go back in time. So great 50 years ago and great today had 2 different meanings. So for example, if I sent you to any social network right now and I said, look at such and such an image, underneath that image, chances are you're going to see a list of 1-word responses about those images. Great, sick, fantastic, awesome, cool, etc. Now, that's complimentary and it's nice and it's great to give people positive feedback, but in most cases, the bulk of those images that you're looking at actually aren't great. They're par, maybe subpar, maybe average, whatever, but they're not great. So we have to redefine what great is. Great is rare. Great is like the best possible work that you can start with. So when you're going to make an illustrated book, starting with the absolute highest quality work that you can make is critical, because it's a combination of things. A book is not just a piece of paper and cardboard. A book is more than the sum of its parts. So it's about the work, it's about the editing and sequencing, etc. But you've got to start with the best possible work that you can produce. Now, my first piece of advice for there is to be patient. So I studied photojournalism. I went to photojournalism school. And back in the day, okay, I'm dating myself here. I graduated in '92. Back in the day, if you were going to do a documentary project, you thought about it in 10-year increments, that you would work on a project for 10 years, and then you would start to decide whether or not you wanted to do a book. Now, obviously, we live in a different world today, but the premise of that, I think, is still very valid today. And what I've seen today is people spending less and less and less time, and with that time comes lack of access and lack of being able to go in the field over and over again, and then the quality of work sort of dips. So just to give you an example, this tiny book here, which is about Sicily, one of my favorite countries in the world. So I spent 5 years working on this project. Now, I've obviously made multiple books of that work, and this is actually the smallest, I would say the most trivial, but also very cool book that I've made. But it took me 5 years. I would go to Sicily every year for 5 years in a row for 2 weeks. I would do the research. I would go and I would shoot, come back, edit. And over a 5-year period, I finally said, okay, I think I have enough here to do a book. So patience, patience, patience is really key. Don't be in a rush. You should go out and shoot as much as possible, repeat what you're doing over and over and over again, and just take your time with it. Okay, the next little mini point within making great work is to do the research. So for you, those of you doing illustrated books, I pretty much guarantee that whatever book you're trying to make, whether it's a portfolio or a children's book, it's someone else has made a similar book in the past. And so instead of looking at that, and I've seen some people get a little discouraged and say, well, this book's already been done. But here's the great thing. Your job as an artist or a creative person is to add to the conversation. That's it. So even if a subject's been done over and over and over again, as long as you're adding something to it, you have every right to do so, and you're probably going to add something that's going to further the dialogue as to whatever your project or your book is. So doing the research is great because it's a building block for you to build on. So if you go out and you find your favorite children's book author, don't be afraid to look at what they've done, realize where it fits in the history of children's books, and then figure out a way for yourself to add into that. Don't just get discouraged or don't say, oh, I'm not going to do that, it's already been done. And if you're doing, like for me, documentary work, it's always nice to reference the work that's been done before. So instead of me coming along and saying, look, I'm going to do a project on, let's say, homelessness in the United States, which has been done a lot, I could say, look, I'm going to do my take on homelessness based on all these other projects that these other photographers have done. They did amazing work, and I'm sort of piggybacking on top of them and moving forward. So that's it. Number one, make great work. Does anybody have any questions in regards to making great work or taking your time? Some people ask about how long it takes to do a project, and that's a really hard question to answer because each one is totally different. If you're doing a project that's, let's say, based on a child's birthday party, then you've got one day to do that, and that's your entire project. If you're like me and you do a project on something that doesn't necessarily have a time element, then I might be able to go back for 3 or 4 years or over a period of 3 or 4 years to do that. So I think you'll know when a project is complete. That's the question that a lot of photographers are asked, is how do you know when something is done and you're ready to go in to start making a book? And I think you will inherently know, because it's your project, you will know when something is finished and you'll be ready to say, look, I want to put this in print. I want to go into book form. So that was the first category, make great work. Any more questions coming in here? Go ahead and write them in. Make sure you pass them in, and then they will forward them on to me. The second section that we are going to do right now, we're moving on, is editing and sequencing. And this is really fun. It can be stressful for some people, and it shouldn't be because it's a big, enormous game that you can put together your book. But editing and sequencing. Now, editing is choosing the images that you want to be in your publication. Your kid's book, your magazine, your portfolio, your workbook. It's just choosing exactly what images you want in there. Now, on the surface, you're thinking, oh, that's easy. I do it all the time. But here's the thing. If you go out and you shoot 1,000 images and you edit to 500, that's not really editing, and there's no way you're going to put 500 images in a book. So editing is actually what I would call the backbone of making a great book. And editing comes with tough decisions, because like we're all the same in some regards, and one of those ways is typically that we fall in love with our photographs or our stories or our whatever it is we're putting in the book. We fall in love, we get so close to it we can't look at it objectively. But when it comes to editing, you have to. And the first little mini point within editing is, and it's a cliche, if you're listening for the cliche alert, Andy can hear it, I think. The cliche alert is you're only as good as your worst image. So I'm going to speak to photographers directly here. If you're editing and you put 9 images in a book or 10 images in a book, and 9 of them are spectacular and one of them isn't, everyone's going to remember that one image. So you really have to edit tight. Less is more. Absolutely. I know, again, that's another cliche, but it's absolutely true. So the fewer, the tighter, the more specific you can be with your edit, the better off you're going to be. Okay, second mini point within editing and sequencing, and that is get a second opinion. I'll speak again to photographers. A lot of photographers are not exactly great editors. They can be great image makers, but editing their own work can be a challenge for anyone. And it is remarkable what will happen when you put your work in front of someone else that you respect. Find a friend, find a neighbor, find a colleague, find someone who's in a photo group, a design group, a book design group, or an art book club, and say, look, I need help here. I need a second opinion, because they will save you from yourself. This has happened to me a million times over, where I thought, oh, I've got this edit nailed, and then you show it to someone and they go, what are you thinking? This is not good. The third little mini point within editing and sequencing is that we are all living in 2017, and we're living in a world that has a very short attention span. Now, here's the tricky thing. You can't design entirely for the attention span, or everything would look like this. Maybe even half of this. It would just be a tiny thing, and then you'd be like, okay, that's it, I'm bored, I'm moving on. So you can't entirely do that. But the other thing you have to do is keep in mind that a lot of people's attention span is not going to be able to consume a book that is like this size, this massive thing. It's not to say you don't make that book, because that book is monumental and it can be super important for you to make as an individual, but it may not be something that your audience will take the time to consume. So you have to think about making things in smaller increments based on that attention span. And again, this could be fun. Think about it. Instead of doing, let's say that you had a giant book like this, right? Which is a beautiful book about Impressionist painting. Imagine you had that and you said, well, I'm going to make that for myself. And then you said, well, I'm going to take that same work and I'm going to divide it up into volumes. And I'm going to publish 10 small volumes that comprise the whole. And then I'll have the giant book for myself and maybe for my collectors or the people that are really interested in my work. And then the volumes will be for everybody else. So you're not stuck with one format. You can look at it in a multitude of different ways. So we're still on editing and sequencing. We've talked about you're only as good as your worst image. We've talked about getting a second opinion. We've talked about continuing your attention span. The next little mini point is the idea of editing for a portfolio or editing for a book. And the easiest way to differentiate between those two things, a portfolio and a book, is that a portfolio is basically a sample of your best work. It may or may not tell a story. It's just your best work, your best design work, illustration, children's photography, whatever it may be. A book has a narrative, it has a story, and so it requires a very specific edit. It may not be your 10 best photographs that tell the story. It may be 8 of your best photographs, and then 2 what I call transitional images that are more educational than aesthetic, that really help the reader sort of understand the story arc and understand where you're going. That's great editing. Editing is like a chessboard in front of you with these pieces that you are constantly moving until, boom, it locks in and you will know. So when I said earlier about getting a second opinion, one of my little super top secret tricks, and I'm not sure for those of you in Europe how this works exactly, but we have delivery services here like FedEx and UPS, etc. And they come to the front door. So I will often have a stack of prints and I will lay them out on the table that I'm using right now. And when the UPS person or the FedEx person shows up, I'll say, hey, what images here do you like? What do you not like? And put them in the order that you would like to see them in a book, just to get like a second opinion. And it's amazing what will happen. Inevitably what happens is my favorite image gets chucked and then I have to start over again. But it's a great exercise and it's fun. So now we're still in editing sequence. We're going to move on a little bit, talk about sequence. Sequencing is the order in which your chosen beloved images land in the book. It's the order that they're in. So you've edited, you've chosen only the best, like the meat and potatoes. You've chosen those, and now you've got to sequence them. Sequencing is the lost art. People don't think about it. They think, I did my edit, I'm going to throw them in. My favorite picture is always going to be on the cover, and blah, blah, blah. That's, throw it out. Not quite right. So sequencing, a single slip in an image, sequencing, can totally change how someone interprets your book. Like, for example, I am not a landscape photographer. I don't know the first thing about shooting landscapes. I love landscape, and I go out and I stare at it, and I think, I wish I could make photos of that actually look like it makes me feel when I'm standing here, and I've never been able to do that. So let's say that I did a project, and it was a people-based project, but in the middle, I, for some weird reason, lost my mind, and I made a landscape photo. And I thought, well, that's kind of a pretty photo. I'll put that on the cover. And then you come into my house, and you look across the room, and you see my beloved book sitting there, which is a people-based book, but you see a landscape photo on the cover, and I know what you're thinking. You're sitting there and you're going, I don't like landscape. I'm not looking at that. So that one little picture that's out of place or out of sequence can totally turn someone off. In the same way, it can totally turn someone onto your book by using a really smart sequence. So the last point in editing and sequencing here is sequencing your work is a role you want your viewers to go like this and like this. You want to hook them in. It's like a great television show where something dramatic happens at the front and you're like, holy cow. And then there's like 10 minutes of backstory and they're trying to fill you in, and then they're building you up again. Like you're on that roller coaster. I hate roller coasters. I hate speed like that. It freaks me out. And then I keep going on them. And I still don't like them. But they antagonize you. It's like click, 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 click. You're climbing, and then I'm thinking, why did I get on the roller coaster? That's what great book sequencing is. Okay. Our first category was make great work. We just talked about editing and sequencing. Who has any problems? Who has any questions about editing and sequencing? Someone out there has to have a question, because I see some peculiar, to put it mildly, peculiar edits on books that I see coming through Blurb. Like I said, I've been around Blurb for a long time. I've seen tens of thousands of books, and I've seen some edits that just make me go like this. Yeah, that's how they make me feel. But you can always redo it. That's the magical part. So, okay, so we've got some questions here. If I use pics in my book, can I use only from authorized places? That's from Nilsa Fleury. So Nilsa, the short answer is you always want to use images from authorized places. The legality issues with photography are incredibly complex from country to country. And so it's hard for me to comment on where you might be and what those laws might be. But you always want to have permission to use work. That's always a great place to start. And I've always been a believer that if there's any sort of doubt about whether or not you should use it, don't use it. There's plenty of, you can go make your own work or find work that's authorized and royalty free, or however it is you want to create that work. That's probably the best bet. Okay, we are moving on here because we have a lot to cover. We talked about making great work. We talked about editing and sequencing, and now we're going to talk about software. Now here's the thing. You know I work for Blurb, right? These are all my countless millions of Blurb publications that I have made over the years. I think there's been like 200 and some. But the thing is, I don't want this to be an infomercial about Blurb. I want you to make books. I want you to make illustrated books. I don't personally care how those are done. I think Blurb is an amazing platform. If you give it a chance and explore it, you'll understand that. But I'm not sitting here and saying you have to do that. But this section in particular is going to be slightly Blurb heavy because I'm talking about software. So there's 4 kinds of software we're going to talk about, and regardless of whether or not you're an advanced bookmaker, an amateur, or if you accidentally stumbled on this Facebook Live and you're like, who is he? Why? What are we talking about? We're talking about illustrated books, and I'm giving you software options. The first one is called Bookright, which is Blurb's sort of flagship software program. Bookright is a standalone software. It's free. You download it. It works cross-platform. It's actually darn good. It doesn't get a lot of publicity and love and people running around with like heart emojis flying out of them talking about Bookright. However, I use it all the time. And in fact, when I started my magazine series, I purposely used the Blurb software to prove, especially to photographers and pros, that the software was very capable. It's also very efficient. It's not a software that you're going to get lost in and get buried in, like, say, I got to start over, Command Q, and like I just lost everything I did. It's very simple. Templates, you can design your own. There's a lot of options. All it takes is a free download and start exploring. I would talk about it in detail, but I think all of us would literally, within 25 seconds, would be asleep, I'm guessing. I mean, it's the 5th of July here. We survived the 4th of July last night. My street was hotter than the surface of the sun. There were so many fireworks going off, just so you know. Okay, so we talked about Blurb Bookright. That's a great starting point, especially for anyone out there who's just getting into bookmaking. The second one I want to talk about is Lightroom, Adobe Lightroom. And the reason I'm talking about that is that 99% of the photographers I know use Adobe Lightroom, including myself. And if you'll notice inside Adobe Lightroom, you'll see a book module. And the book module in Lightroom actually links directly to Blurb. So you can go inside and you can design your book without ever leaving the program. You can drag images into your Lightroom book module. And then maybe you see an image in color that you want it to be black and white. You can go back to the develop module, change it, and it will change automatically without leaving the program. When it comes to software, efficiency is a word that I will say so many times you will probably become ill that I'm going to say it so many times. But efficiency with software is really the key. It's one of the reasons why I've been able to make so many books over the years and use them so strategically, is because I'm efficient when it comes to the software. I don't spend 3 hours on an image and 10 hours designing a page. I know exactly what I'm going after because I've done it enough. So, Bookright, free download. If you're using Adobe Lightroom, you've got the book module built in. You are 2 seconds away from creating portfolios and books. The third one I want to talk about is for anyone who is design orientated, and there's a lot of photographers and just general creative folks who use Adobe InDesign. Adobe InDesign is the industry standard design program. So for example, if you're working with a book designer or a graphic designer or a straight designer, chances are they're using InDesign, and Blurb makes a plugin for Adobe InDesign. Again, it's free. You download it. It loads into Adobe, lands underneath the file menu. Put it this way, I am not a tech person. I'm not a geek, even how I look. I'm not a geek, trust me, believe it or not. And when Blurb made the plugin for InDesign, it allowed me to really embrace that program. I was a little intimidated at first because it's sort of I equate InDesign with like looking at a blank canvas where it's just endless. You have no limitations, and that's a little bit scary at times because you can get stifled by how many options you have. But the plugin basically saved me from myself, fabricated the documents to the exact specifications I needed without me having to stress about it, and then also provides you a way to double check everything at the end because believe me, when I go to double check, I probably on average have about 15 different mistakes per document, and it walks you through each one and says, look, you need to correct that, you need to fix this. It should say you should know better because you've made the same mistake 100 times. Maybe we'll get there someday because I do continue to make the same mistake. Okay. The software we've talked about, Bookright, Lightroom, InDesign plugin, and the fourth and final we're going to talk about is called PDF Uploader. And for you first-time bookmakers, probably not something you're going to want to spend a lot of time with. For anyone out there who has design chops, photography chops, bookmaking chops already, PDF Uploader means you can take an existing PDF without utilizing any of the Blurb software and upload it and have it printed through Blurb. It is fantastic. And again, I know zero about the technical know-how behind this other than the fact that the true geeks that I know talk about how amazing the Blurb PDF uploader is. So take it from them more than me. It's awesome. So in short, what the software section here, what we've talked about is you have options. You have free options. You have pay options. You have very basic, very easy to get started options like Blurb Bookright, and then you have very advanced options like PDF Uploader and InDesign plugin. And that's the thing. Great software is like a great camera. I have a camera here for no apparent reason. I have no intention of using it, but a great camera is something that you never have to think about. You're not standing in the field like this. Yeah. Because if you are, you're not actually paying attention to what you're going to photograph. So you should never be staring at your camera. A great camera is just intuitive. It just works. It sort of molds into who you are, and that's exactly how your book software should be. I don't sit down and go, oh my God, what am I going to use? I'm stressed about it. All I see are the pages and the designs in my brain when I'm in the field making the work, and I want a software that gets out of the way. And so you've got 4 options there to choose from. So let's take a little pause here, checking the time. A little pause here for to go over the software section and see if there's any questions here. We've got a few coming in here. Let me see here. Can you write the sites? Will this be able later? Yes, this program will be able to be viewed right after, I believe, which I have in my script here. I will get to at the end. But yes, because it's so awesome, I know that all of you are probably going to cancel all the plans that you had for the rest of the day and come back here and watch this probably 10 or 12 times if I had to guess, because it's great. So the idea behind this, just so you know, was to give you sort of a treetop level look at the basics of putting a book together. That's all we're doing here. You could deep dive into any one of these sections, but the number one important thing is for you to, 1, have fun, and 2, get started. Don't be afraid. Make a sample book, test it. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in the future. So we've got another question here. So this is Nisha Williams, who missed the first 7 minutes. Nisha, it was probably the most enlightening 7 minutes in the history of the world, but I will recap for you. Do you have to be a photographer to do an illustrated book? And the answer is absolutely not. It has no relevance or bearing whatsoever. I'm using a lot of photography references only because I spent my whole life, which I mentioned in the first 7 minutes, I spent my whole life as a photographer, really. It's sort of in my DNA, in my blood. Every time I try to get away from photography, I get sucked back into it, and I'm actually in the process of making a photography site for the first time in almost 10 years. So you don't have to. Some of the best illustrated books I see are from people who are non-photographers, non-designers, non-illustrators, non-professionals, who just are people who have something interesting to say. And that's really ultimately here what we're talking about. Any excuse you have to put something in print, in my opinion, is a great excuse. Because going to print, making any kind of illustrated book, forces you to do a couple of things that I think are monumental, is the word I'm going to use. One is it forces you to apply critical thought to your work. So the first chapter we talked about was making great work. You have to be able to think very, very clearly and strongly and say, is this great? am I making the right pictures or making the right content or writing the right story or whatever it is, whatever kind of book you're making, forces you to really think about it. And I think today we're so pulled in so many different directions and sort of, our attention spans are kind of maxed out all the time, that critical thought is something I think that's often lacking. So ultimately it's about fun, it's about telling a story. And making books today is incredibly easy and fun. If you make the first one, I guarantee you, and it shows up on your doorstep. There's my front door right here. If it shows up on your doorstep, you're hooked. There's no going back. So fair warning. That's my only that's my public service announcement there. So, all right, let's see here. William J. Rockwell, will you talk about illustrations used in kids' books? I'm not an illustrator, but I have an idea for a book, but need an illustrator. How to find a great one? Okay, William, that's a great question. And then we're going to move on to making the right book. But if you're trying to find an illustrator or designer, or photographer, someone to work with, my first piece of advice is to find someone who's local to you. First of all, you can sit in front of them, you can show them what your aesthetic, they're going to meet you, they're going to look at you, they're going to sort of assess who you are, and you're going to do the same to them. And I think being able to work physically one-on-one with someone is always the best, especially if you're just starting out. And illustrations are so important if you're going to do a children's book, that you want to make sure to have the right one. There are also some services online that you can look for as well. But I'm a big fan of accessing your local illustrator community, your design community, and saying, look, this is who I am, and I want to work with these two or three different people, and then go meet them in person. I think that's the best thing to do. If you live in the middle of nowhere, then you've got to access people online, and that's a little bit more challenging. But again, find someone whose illustrations you've seen that you absolutely can't live without, and approach them. And they may say, look, I'm too busy, or I don't want to do that, or whatever, but they might also help you reference other people in your community or a similar illustrator. I hope that helped. That's a good question though, because a lot of times, like when I did this book, I worked with a designer in Sydney named Chloe Ferris, because I knew that she would make something that I would never be able to make. And I was fortunate enough to have met her in person a couple of years prior. I was sort of planting the seeds over the years, like I'd love to do a project with you, and she was kind enough to take on that project, and she's a brilliant designer, way better than I will ever be. So know your weaknesses, know your strong points, and work to get around them. Okay, we are going to move on. The next section we're going to talk about is making the right book. Now, a lot of times people come up to me and they go, the first question they ask is, what's the biggest book that Blurb makes? Okay, in my opinion, that's the worst possible question you could ask. And I've rarely, if ever, seen the answer to that question turn out well. So some books demand to be big. This is a beautiful book, Impressionism, Erin Hansen. I love this book. It's loaded with, her work is absolutely phenomenal. I'm going to hold it at this funky angle here. It's incredible. And she's prolific, has made a lot of work. But she also did this book. So this book is not better or worse than the big book. It's just different. So bigger is not necessarily better. Bigger comes with a bigger price tag. It can be more difficult for people to buy into your work if they see a book that's $180 or whatever it is, and they say, well, I can't really afford that. So one of the best things you can possibly do is think about your work in multiple formats. So Erin's big book is gorgeous, and for her, an artist at her level that I'm sure is in the gallery world and the museum world and in the private sales world, she needs a book like that. That's a very smart investment. But the small book also fits a specific need. So bigger is not necessarily better.